Well, hello, everyone. And welcome to HR Office Hours. I'm Sandy Zannino. I'm here with my friend, Brad deBeaubien.
Hello, Sandy.
How you doing, Brad?
I'm good. What are we
So,
talking about today?
oh man, well, I just saw something that happened actually in May, and it has to do with the Fair Credit Reporting Act. ADP, their background screening arm, got a little lawsuit from a Connecticut job seeker who they incorrectly reported to the prospective employer of the background screen, and it had some things on the background screen that actually weren't him. It didn't happen, so the employer rescinded the offer of employment. And so this guy is filing against the background screen company, right? Which I thought is pretty interesting. So
Yep.
I thought we could talk about that, because in my world, a lot of times, FCRA is very important in automotive, and when you're doing any kind of banking, Fair Credit Reporting Act. But there's a lot of employers that don't really realize the process is the same pretty much when you're using background screens, which I don't know any employers that don't use background screens. If you're not doing background screens, you should.
But tread carefully. Yeah, no, that's you set that up beautifully. And I see the same thing, in my world, dealing with clients as an employment lawyer, right? People say FCRA, what does that have to do with me? And you're 100% right. I mean, there are very few employers these days that aren't using background checks in some form or fashion. And the Fair Credit Reporting Act, notwithstanding its name, does apply to investigations into people's background, which include, but is not limited to, their credit history. And there's verbiage that says it applies to background checks run for employment purposes. And there's a whole litany of things that you have to do, and authorizations you have to get, and signatures and sign-offs and processes. And so let's unpack that a little bit, because I know this is that, and that's where the trouble lies, and most employers are not aware of it, and they think, well, I've contracted with a background check company, they'll do everything right. And you point out, I'll just wrap this up, you point out they sued ADP, which is interesting, because more often the target is the employer right there, because they're the one that's, pulled the offer, terminated the employment, or what have you. And they may have been a defendant in this case at some point, but my guess is that, some form or fashion, the individual determined that ADP was a deeper pocket, or a more a ready target for this particular action. But the employer, even if the background check company makes a mistake, the employer is the one who really is obligated to do everything by the book. So why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of what that process looks like?
That's right. So this is like one of my little soapboxes that I periodically jump on, and you'll hear me blab about Fair Credit Reporting Act, because for employers, to me, there's such a risk, because there does not have to be any harm. In fact, you can hire the person, right? There doesn't have to be any harm to somebody for them to file, for a claim to be filed, and for penalties and fines to be incurred, which to me is profit loss, right? Like you're working to make profit, and just throw it out the window because you didn't follow a process, right? So vetting, you mentioned something, Brad, that employers think, oh, I have a background screen company, they're going to do everything correctly. It's really important that you as the employer make sure that you are doing all this correctly, because believe me, in your contract with your background screen company, there's going to be a little clause that says we are not liable for any of it, right?
Yep,
like
100%.
I love that smile, and it is one of my pet peeves, right? For a lot of software that they kind of say, well, yeah, and it's really important to make sure that it's a standalone authorization, right? Like that's one of the things that that really can get employers by coupling something else in there, making sure that the background screen company is doing that correctly, making sure that they have any updates to, there was one a couple of years ago that, about, freezes on accounts, like a little line that need to be added in, to some of the documentation that goes back to the candidate. And just making sure that you do that. And the other thing that I find that I think this employer, right, like who knows what's going to be, right, but it's they I don't know for sure, but it looks like they may have rescinded the offer of employment because they may have rescinded the offer of employment before the actual adverse action letter, right? So there's a
so tell us what that adverse action or pre-adverse action notice is, 'cause that may be news to a lot of people.
You're an employer, you get a background screen, that comes back. And I always caution employers too, like, make sure that it applies to your business. Make sure it's not something that happened 20 years ago and has no bearing on who this person is today. As long as it's not like, murder or for example, if in the car industry, if somebody's been convicted, not just arrested but convicted, has to be guilty, right? Like there's some things on the background screen that you might need to pretend isn't there, right? Depending on what it says. So
yeah, it depends on what job you're hiring them to do, what the
yeah,
offense is. There's a temporal, the time, how long ago was it? Was it last year? Was it 20 years ago, as you said? There's a lot that goes into making those decisions. We could probably do a whole other post on
a
that.
whole thing about that. Yeah, that's been a thing with SHRM too, like really pay attention, right? Because anyway, so if there is, and you're thinking about making a decision, the pre-adverse action letter has to go out with all of the I want to say rights and responsibilities, but there's a form that explains their rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, along with the background screen itself and how to contact the background screen company. And you give them, I think the regulation is 5 days. You give them 5 days to respond. I like to make it 10 days just because mail, the US mail doesn't necessarily get there quickly. And give the person the opportunity to respond and say, like this guy, hey, that's not me, right? So you're saying there's a possibility that we are making an adverse action decision on your employment based on this. Do you have anything to say about it? Right.
Go ahead.
And then you send out, after the time period, you send out the adverse action and say you are ineligible for hire.
Right.
Because,
and the point, as this case that you mentioned illustrates, is, right, background check companies make mistakes. There are, 2,000 John Smiths in the state of Florida, right? How do we know we got the right one? Maybe we did, maybe we didn't. And right, there's supposed to be indicators, right? It's a social security number match, just a birth date match, but mistakes get made. And so the point of that pre-adverse action notice is to give the employee an opportunity to speak up and say, hey, I didn't live in this place at this time. I wasn't arrested for this.
Right.
And it just kind of gives a little bit of, fairness and opportunity to be heard in the process before you make a unilateral decision about, that's adverse to this person's interest. I'm not going to hire you, or I'm going to terminate you.
Right. And, sometimes, this is a case in point that sometimes it doesn't matter how big. Who's bigger than ADP?
Right. And then what you saw in that, and this, we're referring to a link that Sandy posted on her LinkedIn, which is an HR Dive article about this case. But it said that ADP, of course, itself had used a third-party vendor to do part of the search, and that's where the trouble began. And so, even though you think, oh, well, I'm dealing with ADP, there's nobody, they're the number one name in the payroll and HR support business. Well, be careful what you're, you can't be too careful. And it really is on you to, as you mentioned, Sandy, get that authorization and disclosure form. That's a separate, and if you're in multiple states, There's multiple state verbiage that needs to go on those, and sometimes those have to be on separate pages. It's all super technical. I know you love hearing that, employers out there, but it's sad but true, and you got to get it right, because as Sandy also mentioned, even if you hire the person, if you've got in their file, the documents that evidence that you didn't get the appropriate authorization before you ran the background check, even if you hired the person and they've suffered no harm, they have a claim against you. There's a statutory damage claim. And, you think, well, one person, $100 or even $1,000, I think that's the range for the statutory damages. No big deal, right? But if you're an employer of any size, you're probably using the same form for everybody. And now you've got a class action on your hands. And those numbers add up fast. And of course, prevailing party attorney's fees, yada, yada, get the lawyer involved and I'll tell you all the stuff you don't want to hear about. But it's,
if you don't believe that, all you have to do is do a Google search.
Yeah.
And you will see I know a couple of years ago, I think Target got like a $24 million over Fair Credit Reporting Act practices.
Yep,
And
we defended a number of them. And again, and several of them were employee, we hired the person, they got fired for some other reason, and then they're grasping at straws, and they go, well, hey, look at this form, they did this wrong. And like I said, it's bogus, and employers, there's a lot of
well, that could be another topic, right? About how to terminate.
Oh yeah. For sure.
They do come up, people when they're terminated, if they're not given a reason, they have to come up with one. Do you have to, it's human nature. So anyway, Brad, it's always awesome talking with you. And if anybody wants to get in touch with either of us, please reach out via LinkedIn. And we'll put our information in the comments. So Brad, it's good to see you too. I'll see you next time.